Hi. The other thing about it for Radio New Zealand, I'm an avid Radio New Zealand listener, national listener, and I used to report for Radio New Zealand. Is the key thing behind is it doesn't show up in the ratings. It's not rated, so the government can sort of say, oh, nobody's listening to it. What a load of crap. Everybody is listening to it. And I actually know people in radio advertising for years who've said, I'd be rich if I could sell advertising on Radio New Zealand. So it could raise the profile of it to help save it. I think it's a great idea just because of that, because there's a whole new generation out there who probably doesn't even know how to find it on the radio. And if it's on TV, they might be introduced to it. And also online, because what Glenn has at the moment, if we have David on his show, we then have a link which has the video of it, which can then go on the website at Unitec to promote this event, and it's gone all around. You know, Russell's seen it. David had already gone on and checked Glenn out before he went on the show. You know, it's because it is online as well, so it becomes a medium that can go everywhere.
Yeah.
And it's also about providing as many options as possible as well. You can provide it in audio only, but you can also provide it in video, and that is what, you know, new generations growing up with all this technology expect.
Can I make three quotes very quickly from macro to micro here?
Yeah.
I think what John is proposing is extremely interesting, and I'd love that conversation to go on. And I think the government should listen, even if John's trying to steal their thunder on this. The idea that you could use the current systems at Radio New Zealand and expand that into other media, in principle, I think is something very worthwhile. But of course, if you're looking at the big picture of public broadcasting and the need for public service across a full range of genres, then I don't think you can stop just there. I think what John is proposing would add a very, very important cornerstone into the contemporary media ecology. But I'm also very aware that the current government is convinced that we no longer need to fund broadcasting institutions. It seems to suppose that the proliferation of digital media in and of itself will be sufficient to ensure that there's a cornucopia of choice for everybody, whereupon everybody can get exactly what they want on demand. Well, dream on, because it ain't that simple. Somebody's still got to make high quality content. I mean, John will tell you how much a New Zealand drama costs, $500,000 to $600,000 an hour, for high quality drama. Now, that isn't going to come out of bargain basement broadcasting. Somebody's got to provide that kind of money, and it's either going to come from commercial advertising, if it's mainstream types of programming, or it's got to come from some sort of public subsidy. So I think the idea that the proliferation of digital channels is somehow going to create this utopia of choice is really believing in the digital tooth fairy. It's simply not that simple. You've got to look at the ways in which those sorts of content are provided. Now, it turns out that the great deal of high-value public service content, particularly news and current affairs, can be achieved through talking heads in studios. But there's an awful lot of other sorts of content that don't quite cost that little.
I understand. Can I quote from John? Radio New Zealand annual report last year? Radio New Zealand carries a unique responsibility to provide independent public service broadcasting for the people of New Zealand. Doesn't say that it's only on radio, and they go on to say it seeks to position itself as the place that more New Zealanders will get their news and information, and it ensures that the value of Radio New Zealand content is maximised for current audiences and unlocked for the benefit of future generations. In the light of these industry trends, Radio New Zealand is conscious of the important role it plays, and it has embraced new platforms and seeks to ensure that it remains at the forefront of new media developments. So actually, what last year's chair said, and I know this year's feels the same, is it is absolutely ideally placed to move into the space.
I'd like to read that carefully against the Radio New Zealand Act to be quite sure that what the chairs are saying is really within the legislative mandate that Radio New Zealand possesses.
Well, part of that is because we used to have a television station, and there isn't one there now.
And that's the issue.
Yeah,
that really is the issue.
I mean about television. I mean, what you said, talking heads is fine for current affairs and news. Country calendar can only happen on television. The way it is and the way it looks.
Does.
And exactly, it does. But why isn't public service television all going to be looking like something that's been filmed, that's been, that's actually got pictures that are more than a shonky studio with a talking head?
I'm sorry, but it's all about content. And I can tell you that if something is really interesting, people will watch just as they listen. And when news is breaking, as it's breaking now, all around the world, people will watch. And when you look at the footage of the riots, not much of that is coming from broadcasters. It's coming from people with iPhones.
Let's see what people in the audience think about this kind of format. And the microphone is to Todd. Todd Nile of Radio New Zealand.
I'd just like to say I'm an employee of Radio New Zealand, so I can't speak for the company, but I'd just like to make a brief comment on a couple of lines that have been dropped, which we as employees are frustrated by. One is there are people out there who would like to think that we are a niche broadcaster, we have a small and declining audience. In fact, in our most recent survey, which is as robust as any radio survey, round the clock, Monday to Sunday, Radio New Zealand was the second biggest radio audience in the country. 6 a.m. to midnight, it is the biggest radio audience in the country. So whatever the future for public television is, and it's important that we have one, as staff, I guess we're concerned that the answer for television does not damage an already financially stressed public radio broadcaster.
Yep.
I think we'd all agree with that. I think the one thing, Todd, that you actually shouldn't undersell yourself on is that don't simply judge Radio New Zealand by those ratings. The fact of the matter is your website is one of the most visited websites in the country. It's under such pressure that in fact it breaks down, and you've got a situation in which you've got a huge and unmeasured on-demand replay audience which is dipping in and out, taking the content as and when they want and living in the now. And that is not being reflected in the numbers. Neither was it reflected in the numbers which the Minister quoted gaily for TVNZ7 when he said, who's watching? Well, a hell of a lot of people weren't necessarily tuning in to watch and being caught on the people meters. And let's face it, that's a pretty limited sample anyway, and pretty corrupt in my view. If you actually saw how many people were dipping in and watching it on replay, on demand, online, it would give you a completely different picture of the level of audience
there are
interest.
actually conventional Nielsen ratings for TVNZ7, but I think if you look at the cumulative audience, it's up to over 1 million a month. So that's a quarter of the country is dipping in every month. So, but a word for the guy behind Radio New Zealand's internet presence, Richard Hulse. I think people like him, are heroes. Gareth Watkin, who you mentioned, there are people who have the vision to see where these two mediums actually interact and relate and complement each other, and they're doing it. So it's not like everything's bad. There are people who are forging ahead and are really making a difference.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd like to just say something about that's come from Gareth's paper, and we're talking technologies here. We're talking about delivery mechanisms, but I think that we have to think about first principles as well. And in Gareth's paper, he mentioned that Leslie Rule of KQED, which is a PBS station in San Francisco, said when they were looking at their demographic for PBS in the States, they said it's about changing the idea of what public broadcasting is. It's now more about broadcasting the public. And I think while we're talking technologies and we're talking delivery mechanisms, we're not talking about the fact that we have got to stop kind of us looking at them kind of mindset, but of looking amongst ourselves.
Yes, I think the kids are going to take the medium over
Absolutely,
anyway, and we've got to encourage
that to
happen. You know, we've got to encourage that to happen.
Can I just, Scott standing there, I'm keen to hear what you're getting out of the online audience.
Well, entirely, I think entirely in line with this conversation. We had a couple of emails. One says, isn't the Arab Spring and uprising a good example of how social media is driving political change in countries that have a centralised broadcasting system? And I quote, power to the people. And another one that asks, isn't this forum a perfect example of citizen journalism? So I think that links entirely to the kind of conversation that's occurring.
Can I take up the first point, which is it social media alone that's doing that? Or is it the fact that social media's interaction with mainstream media is in combination, creating this huge pressure for change?
That's right.
I think it's the two, hand in hand.
I agree. There's a dynamic there, and I think we have to be very careful not to fetishise, what you might call prosumer-driven types of media, where we're both the producer and the consumer of citizen-driven content. I think there's still a place for professional journalism. Give you a case in point. I know a journalist that's well known for doing international reports on conflict, who tried to get a documentary made that was initially accepted by a national broadcaster, and it got shot down by senior management because it was regarded as too politically sensitive. But here's the thing, if you want citizen journalism, who's going to fund that guy to go to Afghanistan or Iraq and report on a war? You can't do that on that scale. Citizen journalism has its place. I think it's a very important development, but it's not a complete substitute for the more traditional forms of journalism, and that still costs money. So I'm a bit sceptical about over celebrating these developments. In fact, I think the other problem that arises here is that quite often we replace a voice of attempted objectivity with a voice of authenticity. The eyewitness account, this is how I saw it and I was there, becomes a substitute for this is my view, but I'm taking this in terms of a much broader reflection on what's happened. Because you can very, very quickly narrow down a point of view. If you look at the London riots, okay, somebody's got a camera on their cell phone and they're maybe streaming that live, but how much context are you getting? Yes. You get the immediacy, but I think you often risk losing the accuracy.
That's right. We've just got a couple of minutes left. Those are all very good points. And I know we've hardly begun to imagine a far more radical future for broadcasting of a public nature. But just very briefly, by way of conclusion amongst the panel, there seems to be, I feel, a sense of an irony here in that we're trying to gather forces together in order to move this on, and all those media tools are at our disposal, but somehow they aren't coming together. I'm not suggesting quite an Arab Spring around public broadcasting in New Zealand, but how could we try to build that sort of coalition so we could be sure that we've got good policy, we can sure we've got access to that digital broadcasting technology, and the scope to expand Radio New Zealand in that way.